A waitress secretly fed an old man every day. One morning, 2 SUVs pulled up to her diner. In a quiet roadside diner that most people barely noticed as they sped along the highway, there worked a young waitress named Alina, a girl with tired eyes but a soft heart that refused to harden despite life's constant disappointments, and every morning before the sun fully rose, she would unlock the diner, sweep the floors, wipe the counters, and prepare coffee for strangers who came and went without ever knowing her story. But among those strangers there was one man who never truly came. Inside, an old man with worn-out shoes, a fragile frame, and eyes that carried a lifetime of silence, who would sit on the bench outside as if waiting for something that never came, and at first Alina noticed him only in passing, assuming he was just another drifter. But one cold morning when she saw his hands trembling and his lips pale from hunger, something inside her refused to ignore him, so she quietly wrapped a sandwich, poured a cup of hot tea, and walked outside, placing the food beside him without saying a word, and the old man looked at her with surprise, as if kindness was something he had forgotten existed, and from that day forward, it became her secret routine. Every morning she would set aside a small portion of food before the diner opened and bring it to him, never asking questions, never expecting thanks, and he never spoke much either, only nodding gently, his eyes sometimes glistening as if holding back emotions too heavy to express, and weeks turned into months, and this silent bond between them became something steady and comforting, like a quiet promise that even in a harsh world, someone still cared. And yet Alina never told anyone, not her boss who constantly warned her about wasting food, not her coworkers who might laugh or complain, because she knew how fragile this small act of kindness was, and she feared it might be taken away if exposed, and so she continued, day after day, feeding the old man while the world rushed past them, unaware of the small miracle happening outside that diner, until one morning, everything changed, because just as Alina stepped outside with the usual sandwich and tea, she noticed something unusual. 2 black SUVs parked near the diner, their engines still running, their polished surfaces reflecting the early sunlight in a way that felt out of place in such a humble setting, and before she could fully process what was happening, the doors of the vehicles opened and several well-dressed men stepped out, their presence sharp and serious, and for a moment her heart raced with fear, wondering if something terrible was about to unfold. But instead, the men walked directly toward the old man, who sat there as always, calm and unmoving, and one of the men bent slightly, speaking to him with a tone of deep respect, a tone that did not match the image of a forgotten, homeless figure, and Alina stood frozen, holding the food in her hands, unsure whether to approach or retreat. And then, slowly, the old man turned his head toward her, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled fully, not the faint, tired smile she had seen before, but something warm and complete, and he gestured for her to come closer, and though nervous, she stepped forward, and one of the suited men looked at her and said, "Are you the one who has been taking care of him?" And she hesitated before nodding, unsure what she had done wrong. But instead of anger, the man's expression softened, and he said, "You have no idea who he is, do you?" And she shook her head, and then the truth unfolded in a way she never could have imagined, because the old man she had been feeding every day was not just a forgotten soul, but a man of immense wealth and influence, someone who had once built a vast business empire but had chosen to disappear from that world after personal tragedy took everything he loved, leaving him to wander alone, testing not the world, but perhaps his own faith in humanity. And the men explained that they had been searching for him for months, trying to convince him to return, but he had refused, until now, and Alina could barely process what she was hearing, her mind overwhelmed by the contrast between the fragile man she knew and the powerful figure they described. And then the old man reached into his coat, pulling out a small, worn envelope, and handed it to her with trembling hands, and when she opened it, she found a simple note written in careful handwriting that read, "Kindness is the only wealth that never fades," along with a check that made her breath catch, more money than she had ever seen, enough to change her life entirely. But before she could say anything, tears already forming in her eyes, he gently shook his head, as if to say that no words were needed, and in that moment she realized that what she had given him was not food, but something far greater, dignity, warmth, and a reminder that even in his darkest days, he was still seen, still valued. And as the men helped him stand and guided him toward the SUVs, he paused one last time, looking back at her with gratitude that words could never fully express, and then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt both empty and full at the same time, and Alina stood there for a long while, the morning sun rising higher, the world continuing as usual, but something inside her had changed forever, because she now understood that even the smallest acts of kindness can echo in ways we may never fully see. And though the diner remained the same, and her routine continued, every time she looked at that empty bench, she felt a quiet sense of purpose, knowing that in a world often too busy to care, she had chosen to stop, to notice, and to give, and in doing so, she had not only changed someone else's life, but her own as well. The days that followed felt strangely quiet to Alina, as if the world outside the diner had lost a small but meaningful rhythm that only she had ever truly noticed. And though customers still came and went, laughing, complaining, ordering their meals, without a second thought, there was an emptiness that lingered near the door, near that old wooden bench where the man had once sat every single morning, and more than once she caught herself preparing an extra sandwich out of habit, only to pause midway and realize there was no one to give it to anymore, and yet she couldn't bring herself to stop entirely, because something deep inside her held on to the belief that kindness, once begun, should never simply end, and so she would quietly wrap the food anyway and place it aside, almost like a ritual that kept his memory alive in her daily routine, and at night when she returned home to her small, dimly lit apartment, she would take out the envelope he had given her, reading the simple line again and again, "Kindness is the only wealth that never fades," as if trying to fully understand the weight of those words, because it wasn't just the money that overwhelmed her. It was the realization that something she had considered so small had carried such enormous meaning for someone else, and she began to question everything about the way she saw the world, wondering how many other people like him existed, unseen, unheard, quietly fading into the background of busy lives, and that thought stayed with her, growing stronger each day until it became impossible to ignore, and one evening after closing the diner, instead of going straight home, she walked a little further down the street, past the usual stops, until she reached an area she had rarely paid attention to before, where a few homeless individuals gathered near a dim alleyway, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure of what she was doing or how she would be received, but then she remembered his eyes, that quiet gratitude, and she stepped forward, offering the extra food she had brought, and though the reactions varied, some surprised, some cautious, some immediately thankful, there was a shared sense of relief that reminded her of him, and in that moment she realized that what had started as a secret act for one person had now become something much bigger. Something that could no longer be contained to a single bench outside a diner, and so her evenings slowly transformed into something new, something meaningful, as she began setting aside portions of food every day, not just for one person but for several, and though it wasn't always easy, especially when her boss started noticing the missing items and questioning her, she found ways to make it work, sometimes using her own money, sometimes cutting back on her own needs, because now she understood that kindness required sacrifice, and yet it gave back in ways far more valuable than anything she gave up, and weeks passed like this until one afternoon something unexpected happened again, though not as dramatic as the SUVs, it carried a different kind of significance, because a well-dressed woman walked into the diner, someone who clearly did not belong to the usual crowd of travelers and locals, her presence drawing quiet attention as she took a seat near the counter and ordered a simple cup of tea, and when Alina approached to serve her, the woman looked at her with a calm, knowing expression and asked softly, "You're Alina, aren't you?" And the question caught her off guard, making her pause, but she nodded cautiously, unsure of what was coming next, and the woman smiled gently before saying, "He told me about you," and in that instant, Alina knew exactly who she meant. Her heart skipping a beat as a mixture of curiosity and emotion rushed through her, and the woman introduced herself as someone who had worked closely with the old man for many years, someone who had seen him at his highest and his lowest, and she explained that after leaving the diner that morning, something had changed in him, something profound, because for the first time in a long while, he had spoken about hope, about humanity, about the quiet strength of compassion, and that he had insisted on returning to his former life not to reclaim power or wealth, but to use what he had to create something meaningful, something that reflected the kindness he had experienced in its purest form, and as Alina listened, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, not pride, but something deeper, a sense of connection to a story much larger than herself, and the woman then placed a small folder on the counter and gently pushed it toward her, saying, "He wants you to be part of it," and when Alina opened it, she found documents outlining a new initiative, a foundation aimed at providing food, shelter, and support to those in need, with plans to expand across cities and reach countless lives, and at the bottom of the first page was a handwritten note from him, inviting her to join not as a charity case, not as someone being rewarded, but as a partner, someone whose compassion had inspired the entire vision, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed, unsure if she was capable of stepping into such a role, because she was just a waitress, someone who had spent her life unnoticed, unremarkable, doing what little she could in her small corner of the world. But then she thought back to those quiet mornings, to the simple act of offering food without expectation, and she realized that she had already been part of something meaningful long before she even knew it, and perhaps this was simply the next step, the natural continuation of a path she had unknowingly started. And so after a long pause, she looked up at the woman and said yes, her voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead, and from that day on, her life began to change in ways she could never have imagined, not suddenly or magically, but gradually, with challenges and doubts along the way, as she learned how to navigate a world far different from the diner, working alongside people who spoke in terms she had never used, making decisions that affected more than just a few meals, but entire communities, and yet through it all, she held on to the same simple principle that had guided her from the beginning, that kindness did not need to be complicated, it did not need to be grand or visible, it only needed to be real. And as the foundation grew, reaching more people, opening more doors, creating more opportunities, she made sure that no matter how large it became, it never lost that core, that human touch that had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when she had a moment to herself, she would visit that old diner, now under new management but still standing as a reminder of where everything began. And she would sit on that same bench outside, looking at the empty space where he once sat, and she would smile softly, knowing that while he had come and gone, what he left behind was not just a memory, but a living, growing impact that continued to touch lives every single day. And in those moments, she understood something deeply and completely, that the world does not change only through power or wealth or grand gestures, but through the quiet decisions people make every day to care, to give, and to see one another, and that sometimes, all it takes to start something extraordinary is a single act of kindness, offered without expectation, to someone the world has forgotten.